In this video, we're going to use the Polygon Extrude, the CV Curve tool, and the Bezier Curve tool to create the geometry pictured here. We'll begin by creating this blossom piece at the very top. If I hit 1 on the keyboard, you can see it is a simple revolved shape with some extruded poly faces. Going to my orthographic front view, I'll hold down my space bar and I'll go to Create, Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool, and I'm going to go to the Attributes. I set it for 1 linear, and I'll start to create the shape that'll form the base. I'm going to snap the vertices at the top and the bottom of this shape to the grid so I get a nice flat surface for when I extrude the faces up here for the petals. And then I need a flat surface at the bottom when I extrude the actual stem. Returning to my object mode, I'll center pivot, and holding down D on the keyboard, I'll move the pivot to where I'd like to revolve this. I'll hold down the space bar, I'll go to Surfaces, I'll go to Revolve Attributes, and I'm going to set it for Y, quads and count, and I've set the count for 30. I'll go to my perspective view. Now ideally I'd like to have one face on the top of this surface for each of these. So I'll center the pivot and I'll move it away from the path so I can edit the path. Right clicking and choosing Control Vertexes. Now I can move these around till I get what I want at the very top. Now you can see that by moving them as well you can get more surfaces if you want, but I'm going to go with these 5 faces at the top. Next we'll create those polygon surfaces at the very top and extrude them. I'll right click and choose face, and I'll shift select all the ones at the very top edge. And I'll go to my Extrude tool, holding down the space bar, edit mesh, and extrude attributes, and I'll reset it to the default, and I'll hit apply. Now when you do that, you'll see a sub-menu appears. And I want the faces to be separate, so I have separate petal shapes for each of these surfaces, these polygon faces. So I'll click on Off, and I'll start to pull it up. And if I access the Scale tool now, I have separate polys. I'll continue by maybe giving a little length. And if I click on the center one, I can now flare them out a bit. And I'll go back and forth until I get that surface the way I want. As I introduce the faces, I'll hit 3 on the keyboard to see what I have so far. So I'll put 1 more level of poly faces. I'll either click on the Polygon Extrude tool, or I can hit G on the keyboard to add another row. I'll start to pull them up. And I'll center it by clicking on the blue dial, and I'll scale them out a bit. And then I'll return to the vertex setting that was previously introduced when I first had the tool on, and I'll start to taper the very edges of them. So if I hit 3 on the keyboard, I'm starting to get what I want here. I'll hit 1 on the keyboard. I want this to be somewhat more asymmetrical, so I'll start to select faces at the top individually, and I'll start to change the length, direction. I can right click and choose edge, and I can select a set of edges, and I can move those around. I'll right click and choose object mode, and I'll delete by type history. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make the stem piece. We'll extrude it by starting at the base of the shape we just created. We'll need 3 of these at least, so I'm going to duplicate it. I'll hit Command D and I'll take the duplicate, and we're going to go to the very bottom of it, and we're going to snap the vertices at the bottom and seal the geometry. I'll right click, I'll select the vertices, hold down the space bar, go to Edit Mesh, and merge to center. Now often enough when you make geometry you'll start to see these gray shadows. I'll go to my object mode, select, holding down the space bar, I'll go to Mesh Display, and I'll choose Harden Edges. Now I want to put this in position on my template, and I'll start by putting the pivot down at the very base of the geometry. So if I hold down D and V, I can now snap it down to the very base. And that'll let me go to an orthographic view in this instance and start to put it into position and scale it to the size I want and rotate. Now the next thing I want to do is draw the path from which I can extrude the stem. In my orthographic view, I'll hold down my space bar, I'll go to Create, Curve Tools, Bezier Curve Tool, and I'll start up where I want to join it and extrude the geometry from this blossom shape. I'll start to click and drag to get the curve. I'm going to stop right at the second one that begins right in here because we're going to have to make that shape separately. I'll turn off the template for a moment so I can kind of make this curve a little bit more gradual. And with my path in the object mode now, I'll select the blossom shape, go to my perspective view, and I'll hit F on the keyboard. Now we want to select the faces just on the bottom, so I'll right click and choose face, and I'll shift select those faces. And now I'll shift select the path. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to Edit Mesh, I'll go to my Extrude Tool again, and I'll go to the Attributes. In the attributes, I'll make the divisions 20, and I'll hit return to set that. The higher the divisions, the more gradual the curve will be. I'll leave all the other settings alone, and I'll hit apply. So I should be looking at something similar to this. I'll hit 3 on the keyboard. I'm going to start introducing the leaves that appear in the template. I've used my edge loop tool to add an extra edge in here in which to extrude that leaf from. Once I've done that, I'll right click and choose face, I'll select the top faces, and I'll click on my Extrude Tool, and I'll center it by clicking on the blue dial, and I'll start to pull it up and scale it and taper it a bit. Now I don't want that little peak shape, so I'll right click and choose edge, I'll select that edge, hit W and move it down, and now I can reselect those faces and start to extrude the shape of the leaf I might want. I'll click on the Extrude Tool, I'll center it, pull it up on the y-axis, and I'll begin to scale it out to give it the flatness of the leaf shape. I'll hit G to repeat the function, or click on the Extrude Tool again, center it, pull it up. I'll hit G, I'll pull it up, and I'll start to taper it. I'll hit 3 on the keyboard to preview what I have, so you can see how quickly you can start to create the shape you might want. Now I'm going to introduce a couple more leaves here on this main stem, and then when we come back, we'll create the bottom section that appears down here. Now that I've got a little bit more done on that main stem at the top, we're going to create the one down at the bottom. I'll go to my orthographic view, and I'll select the blossom shape. I'll hit Command D to duplicate. And I'll bring it over to the area that I'm going to be using it. I'll move the pivot to the base of the geometry by holding D and V on the keyboard and snapping. I'll start to scale it, and I'll place it in position and rotate it. Now I know the base has gotten tapered too, so I need to broaden just the very bottom. I'll go to the perspective view, hit F on the keyboard, and I'll just rotate a little bit. And in here I'll go to face, I'll select those faces at the bottom. And I'll just scale it out a little bit. In my orthographic view, I'll look for the thickness of that template. And then once again in the perspective view, I'm going to snap the vertices at the bottom together. I'll choose vertex, select and adjust those 4 vertices. I'll go to edit mesh and merge to center. Now we'll go to our orthographic view and we'll draw the path to give us the bottom part of that stem. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to Create, Curve Tools, Bezier, and I'll start where the blossom is. I'll hit return, right click, choose control vertex, and I'll start to fine tune the edge a bit. I'll return to my object mode for my path. I'll go to perspective view, and in the perspective view I'll select the faces at the bottom. Now again, I've got these shadows, so I'll select the geometry, hold down the space bar, I'll go to mesh display, harden edges. At the bottom I'll right click and choose face, I'll shift select those 5 faces, and then shift select the path. I'll go to edit mesh, extrude attributes, and I'll set it for 20 again. I'll hit return or enter to set it and hit apply. And I'll hit 3 on the keyboard to see what I have. So I'll return to my orthographic view and I'll turn my template on and I'll start to line up the geometry. So if I turn off my template and go to my perspective view, I've got something like this. Next we'll create the blossom, and the blossoms are made exactly the same way, just edited a little bit more refined and flared out more. To do so, we'll go to our orthographic front view again. I'll hold down the space bar, go to Create, Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool, it's already set for 1, and I'll start to make the blossom shape. I'll center the pivot, hold down D, and move the pivot where I'd like it to revolve from. Holding down the space bar, surfaces, revolve attributes, and I'll leave it at 30 and hit apply. Going to my perspective view, I'll center the pivot, and I'll move it away from the path to see what I need to adjust for the top to get that single face again. Sometimes it's difficult to get that flat edge on top, so we can start to edit the actual edges of the geometry. So I'll right click and choose edge, I'll double click on one of the outside edges, and I'll move it down kind of out of the way, and then I'll double click on the one at the very top, and I'll scale that out. And if I wanted to, I could double click on the one on the inside and taper it so that the actual blossom petals are a little bit thinner and more delicate. Now I've got that gray shadowy look, so I'll go to my object mode, hold down the space bar, mesh display, harden edges. Now it's just a matter of extruding those petals the way I want. Before I extrude the petal shapes, I need to change my settings for my Extrude Tool. I'll hold down the space bar, edit mesh, extrude, and I'll reset. Now I'll get a single face. I'll set the keep faces together off, I'll pull it up, and I'll start to scale them to separate them out a bit. I'll click on the blue dial, and I'll scale them to flare them out. I'll hit G on the keyboard, pull out the next set. I'll center it with the blue dial, and I'll flare them out some more. And then I'll return to the first setting, and then I'll taper it. So by going back and forth, I can pretty much put together what I need. for the blossom shape. I'll right click and go to object mode. I'll hit 1 on the keyboard. And there's a bit of a bell taper here between here and the base. So I'll hold down the space bar, I'll go to edge, double click on this edge, and I'll get the scale tool and I'll pull it in a bit. And I'll go down to the next one. And I'll move it up, scale that in a bit. I'll hit 3 on the keyboard, and now I've got more of a tulip shape. Now all I would have needed to do is move this into position, create a Bezier curve, and extrude it from the bottom. So we'll do one more, and then I think it's pretty clear on where you need to proceed to get the completed structure. I'll hit 1 on the keyboard, I'll go to the base, choose the vertexes, get the base vertices, and I'll merge to center under Edit Mesh. And I'll need to extrude the shape of the stem from this as well. So I'm going to go to the orthographic views, and I'm going to flatten that out. Now this is much too wide for a stem shape, so now I need to go in and start to model that. And I might use my soft select on this a bit, and I'll start to taper it in. And if I go to my perspective view now, I can have a better idea of what I need for this. So the first thing I'll do is I'll right click, go to my object mode. I'll hold down D and V to snap the vertex down to the bottom of it. I'll hit Command D, and then in my orthographic view I'll start to put it in the area of the template where the first blossom would be. I'll start to scale it down. I'm going to go to my orthographic view to see what that base looks like in the context of the thinness I'll need for that stem. So that might need to be a little bit more tapered based on the thickness of this. So I'll go ahead and select the faces at the bottom. And then I'll go to my orthographic view and I'll draw my path. Returning to the object mode of the geometry. Holding down the space bar, going to Create, Curve Tools, Bezier, Curve Tool. I'll start where the blossom begins, and I'll draw the shape I need. Returning to my object mode, my perspective view. I'll select the base of the tulip and shift select the path, and in my extrude window I'll bump it back to 20, hit return to set the amount, and hit apply. So if I go to my perspective view, I'll hit 3 on the keyboard, and I have something like this. Now I might want the stem to be a little thinner here, so I'll Z it out, leaving the menu up. I'll shift to deselect the path, and I'll scale the base a little bit more. Shift select the path again and hit apply. And I'll hit 3 with the smooth proxy, and now I have something like this. Now it is defined logic by going through the original shape, so that would be simply a matter of right clicking, choosing vertex, and I'll select some of these vertices. I'll hit B on the keyboard to go to my soft select, so I get a nice soft edit, and I'll just pull this out where it should not be crossing into the other geometry. And those basic elements will get you the rest of this as well. So in the case of the other blossom with its own stem, we would simply take that duplicate we kept to the side, position it, scale it, and draw the Bezier, and then extrude it